Good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this webinar that we're now kicking off about ECW's Global Estimate Report, the 2026 update. This event was co-convened with Education Cannot Wait, the Interagency Network for Education in Emergencies, as well as the Geneva Global Hub for Education in Emergencies, of which I am the director, Petra Heusser, in case we haven't had the chance yet to meet. I know that many of you, as well as us, we've been waiting for this report, which provides the latest evidence on the scale and the drivers of educational exclusion in crisis settings. So we're very fortunate that today the authors of this report will present its finding, and together afterwards we will discuss the policy implications for practice, and how this data can strengthen advocacy and investment in education for those children left furthest behind. Not least, we will also consider how this report can support ECW's replenishment campaign that is soon to kick off. As for the format and housekeeping, we have 60 minutes for this webinar. Please feel free to use the chat box for any questions you might have during the presentations, and we also hope to have some time towards the end for live questions. Kindly also note that this webinar is being recorded, and please be on mute. I think we all muted you, so later when we come to the live questions, you're invited to raise your hand if you would like to speak, and we will unmute you. So with that, I'm handing over to ECW's Christian Stoff. He's the Chief of Evidence, Results and Reporting, and he has been supervising the development of this report. So Christian, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Petra. So let me start first, not long, so that we have enough time to discuss the findings, just to situate the report, what it is not, and the incredible amount of data that we actually went through and how we packaged it to get to the findings. Next slide, please. So on the scope of the report, you see on the left side, basically a few descriptions of what this report is, and on the right side, what it is not. And so first on the left side, this is really an attempt to have a neutral, leverage the best possible data from different data sources, from research, official statistics from countries, combining it in and triangulating it in many ways for crisis-affected areas to get at a framework that allows us to have indicative, comparable global estimates of children affected by crisis, and how many out of those crisis-affected children are out of school. This is really then gets us to a comprehensive data set across many countries. You will see 87 countries are captured in this study to give sort of a lot of basis for advocacy, prioritization, but also research efforts, because there's a lot of findings in that data that can still be generated, which are not yet in the report, and we will talk about this later. And of course, for planning for ECW, that's a big part. Also, we have integrated these global estimates and also into our investment decisions, where we would invest in which countries. It's a consistent method across the countries, using the best possible data, and what it offers is really an open resource that everybody can use, a database itself, an out-of-school children a rate matrix for all the different countries with a lot of disaggregated data available, and this year as a new feature, an interactive dashboard where you can actually play around with the data. You can basically access and visualize the data in many different ways. What it is not, and that is a very important point, that when you see a country listed on the dashboard, and then you see, for example, in the downloadable table, an out-of-school rate for that country, that should not be confused with it being a national out-of-school rate. Yeah, for national out-of-school rates, you would have to go to UIS. That's the UNESCO Institute of Statistics. And the general report, they have educationestimates.org. You can track basically through those sources the national values. What this study does is really look at just crisis-affected children and how many out of those crisis-affected children, what is their out-of-school rate. That is why you see and OOSCIE, which is in emergencies, out of school children in emergencies. So that's an important point. So it doesn't replace these country level statistics. What is also important when you look at, for example, the total number of crisis affected refugee children, school-aged refugee children. In our study, that is not sort of replacing the UNHCR figures on the global school-aged refugee population. Why? Because UNHCR captures also refugee children in Germany, for example. Yeah, but what we are looking at those refugee children that are really in severe crisis contexts. Yeah, so in host countries that have difficulties based on these standards that we implement and the framework that then are classified as crisis affected refugee school-aged children, and then how many out of them are out of school. So it's really complementing that. These country figures are not coming from just one source. They are combined from different sources, triangulated, and it's therefore not like an official estimate. It's a research effort to come to the possible guesstimates, let's say, on what the crisis-affected number of children is currently based on different severity ratings and what is their out-of-school rate and numbers and so forth. Next slide. So how does this compare to other frameworks? Well, there is sort of GCPA, the Education Under Attack. The report came out just recently. This is really about documented attacks on education and military use of schools. And they have, of course, aggregate numbers as well. But this is about capturing incidents. That, of course, also has a linkage to the UN monitoring and reporting mechanism, children in armed conflicts, that tracks grave violations against children, including attacks on schools. That's also on incidents. The cluster level figures on people in need or children in need of education, and those that are the target figures out of those, that's a different kind of scoping, because that is, for example, affected by the humanitarian reset. So basically, if the available resources are less, what we are seeing now is that the identified needs are also shrinking in a way because of that lower scope. Because for political reasons, you don't want like these figures to balloon over time too much. So there is a political aspect to it, which then actually goes into the numbers of crisis-affected children, for example, that leads to shrinking. We try to provide a more neutral resource on sort of more neutral data sources. So it's also then used more for planning rather than just describing actually global figures. So that's where our report comes in. It provides head counts on crisis-affected children, out of school rates, learning outcomes across all crisis-affected areas using common approaches. Next slide. The new features in this report to highlight is there's really, we were impressed. I mean, Matteo, working with him over the last 6 months on this, we were impressed, in terms of the availability of MSNA data, which is a fundamental data source, the multi-sectoral needs assessment data conducted by REACH or Impact Initiatives, offers the largest data set ever we had on crisis contexts, which we benefit over the past 3 years. We have data from 25 plus crisis contexts, and more than actually 500,000 interviews that were conducted with households, including a large share out of those even on the barriers to education, for example, which we also included. It looks at, for the first time, not just at an overall global figure like what we did. You may remember 222 million, then 234 million, and you have these just one figure. What we provide now is we disaggregate by severity for the first time. So when you look at the findings, you see there's a 253 million figure, but then there's also out of those is 182 million are in most severe crisis settings. So, and then we look at the statistics just in those settings, which is an interesting additional perspective, and also reduces it from 87 countries to just 20 countries, basically. And so we can actually use those figures depending on what messages we want to provide. Then we included a more refined analysis on the premia, what we call, and these premia look at basically there's an average out of school rate of crisis-affected children, but we do have data on disaggregated figures for IDPs, for refugees, and so forth. For children with disabilities, even the prevalence on disabilities changes in crisis context. So we leverage research studies, anchor studies, how we call them, to then actually add these premiums to the average out of school rate to understand better for these different groups what their out of school rates are. We have, and that's linked to it, also sharper disability estimates. We also have an in-depth analysis of the barriers to education, the progression deep dives where we look at transition, because we have also age-specific data from the MSNAs, and Matteo will talk about all the findings behind that, and also a deeper learning analysis, because we have the ICANN, the common assessment on numeracy and reading from the PAL network, which we leverage to understand better in crisis contexts, how are these learning trajectories affected by the crisis. And there's, of course, a lot more notes in the report on some of these methodological innovations also. Next slide. So here's just a methodological overview, not going too much in depth, but if you have questions, don't hesitate to reach out. There are these 6 different phases and stages that we go through. The first stage is to screen and classify crisis. What is a crisis in itself and who is affected? And of course, like in the developed settings, you might have some people may say there's a crisis happening, yeah? But how do we actually scope it? And that is a big kind of methodological question that we had. And you can see the description that we used in the reports, but we try to really look at, from a humanitarian perspective, what's actually a crisis, and in particular, when it comes to stage 2, how actually a crisis is scoped is really in relation to how much it affects education potentially. And we use research that links basically the different types of crisis and what impact it has on education. So how much does a drought have impact on the education access, for example, and the trajectories and so forth, and conflict, of course. And based on that, we then select sort of the data sources and the scoping of our crisis in relation to how much it has the potential or the actual impact on disrupting education. Then we have a disaggregation in the third stage on the affected groups. We have not forcibly displaced populations, IDPs, refugees, asylum seekers, and we use population data from UN then to disaggregate those figures, as well as from UNHCR and IDMC. Then we build an out-of-school rate matrix in emergencies. So that's this long acronym that you see. And we will show you what that looks like. Is for basically 50 different disaggregations for 87 countries. You have the best sort of guesstimates on their out-of-school rates. And that is also available on the landing page to download. We then, and that's what I mentioned before already, out of school that estimates the way we add premia, basically. And I will talk in one slide later on that. And then finally, estimating the learning gaps, how many in the schools are actually learning. Next slide. Here, I won't go into detail, but for each of these stages, it's not just one data source. It's like combining it from many different data sources within a framework of choices that we identified. And we use, for example, informed severity index from ACAPS that to screen, classify crisis. Then we use ACLED data to look at the conflict aspect, EMDA data to look at the natural disasters, IPC on sort of food security indicators. Population data. So I won't go into detail, not to lose time on the findings, but you see basically there's a wealth of data that goes into this report. Next slide. So then on the premia, just to mention what we look at is for the internal displacement premium. What we find is that the average out of school rate, well, there's a big differential between sort of non-forcibly displaced and internally displaced children. And we get that data also within the MSNAs, because sometimes they ask these questions. So from that data set, we can see these differences. And it makes actually quite a difference depending on the cycle and the sex of the child is between 9 to 14 percentage points, the difference in out-of-school rates. Then we have the novel feature, the disability adjustments, and there are two steps. So one is on the disability prevalence itself. So we know that in conflict settings, we looked at research, is that if you are disabled, well, the disability prevalence actually changes in a conflict settings. One is, of course, like injuries. Well, that's a small kind of, depending on the conflict, increase. But then there's also psychosocial consequences. And those psychosocial difficulties are part of the child functioning module, sort of the international classification on functioning and disabilities. You have to include that for children. So if a child has anxiety or depression, that actually, if they have that on a daily basis, that would actually constitute a disability in itself. So therefore, if you take those into account, which surveys so far rarely do in humanitarian settings, you underestimate the prevalence rate. So we adjust for that. The other thing is out-of-school rates themselves for children with disabilities. We leverage the mixed data set from UNICEF to look at what's the differential, how much more likely children with disabilities in such crisis settings are, how much more likely are they out of school? And we find that, and we put that as a premium. That is not available in all countries. So we use that differential that we estimate in the countries where we have data, and we use it to then basically give us the global estimates for that. So there's some imputation actually then happening. Next slide. And that's, I think, the final one before I hand over to Matteo. This gives us an out-of-school rate in emergencies matrix. And you see it's 50 by 87, the matrix, 87 crisis-affected countries, 50 subgroups by displacement status, by sex, by education cycle, and disability. And this gives you can download the whole matrix, and you can see basically and do analysis and research on these differences, and then go more in depth to understand what the mechanics are behind those. So it's a starting point perhaps for research, we would say, but also for advocacy products. And then we added this time reliability ratings, because some data, as I said, is imputed. So we colored it red, those out of school rates. And if the data is likely outdated, well, then we classified it as medium if it just draws from UIS national estimates, because it's not crisis effect population specific. So we classify that as medium. That's a conservative floor. But then we look at whenever we take recent MSNA data and we have that available, then that's the best first primary data on that crisis affected children population. We call it green, and we call it a high reliability. Okay, let me then, I think that's the last slide before handing over to Matteo to talk about the actual findings using that methodology.
Thank you, Christian.
Over to you, Matteo Valenza. We haven't introduced him yet.
Hi everyone. Matteo Valenza. I am the person who crunched all these numbers. Let's dive into the key findings. I think the first one is that, of course, the crisis keeps deepening. There's 258 million affected. So because this methodology we use this time around is pretty much the same in essence, although with improvements to the previous one, we are able to have a sort of a round-on-round comparison, and we have about 20 million more in less than 2 years. Out of these 258, 93.2 million are out of school completely. Needs are also highly concentrated. 80% of out-of-school children in emergencies are in 20 countries, and the top 10 countries host 2/3 of the whole stock of out-of-school children in emergencies. Okay, so there's a high concentration in exclusion. This exclusion is also deeply unequal, and we see that we go from this 36% overall out-of-school rates for crisis-affected children globally. Okay, this is not a global figure, it's just for crisis-affected, as Christian pointed out earlier. That rate goes up to 40% when we look at crises of extreme severity. It goes up to 52% when we look at IDPs in the most extreme crisis. And it goes all the way to 74% when we look at refugees in the most extreme crisis. So this study really sheds light on the trends and inequities that we can see across groups all over the world. To put some good news, though, families have not really given up. The analysis of barriers from the MSNA data shows that the two prevailing barriers, the most prevalent barriers, are cost and conflict closures. But there is a willingness to keep children in school that is very strong, and it comes out very strongly from the feedback that we had from the affected population. So there is a strong demand that we, as an international community, have the duty to meet. For the first time, we go quite in depth about learning loss, and we see that early learning loss can become exclusion later with a general trend of worsening of secondary out of school rates, unfortunately, which are way above national averages and way above regional averages for non-crisis affected populations. We also investigate different drivers of crisis, and we study learning loss, and we see that conflict deepens learning deficits. So whenever there's a conflict, the learning outcomes are even more depressed than they would be under normal circumstances. And the effects are huge, as we will see later. For the first time, thanks to the MSNA data, and I want to thank definitely Rich and those who helped us, Maria Mondin and Martina Witt, who actually helped us going through the microdata here, and we were able to study in depth the different types of exclusion patterns that actually concern, for example, IDPs or forcibly displaced children. And we see that the progression through the grades is much slower for forcibly displaced children, and the overage enrollment is also much more common. Okay, so there's new findings on the magnitude of these effects that were a little bit blurred before. And for the first time, we could take a deep dive in these, and we'll talk about it a little bit in more detail in one of the next slides. Next slide, please. So we've talked about the big headline figure. We see that conflict and violence is the most prevailing driver. And we see that in terms of regional breakdown, Sub-Saharan Africa is really the heart of the crisis. 38 countries, 128 million children affected, children of school aged, of course. Next slide. For the first time, we screen and classify crises according to their severity. This is a complex measure. We're not going to go through the details, but it basically mirrors the methodological choices of the Informed Severity Index. And once again, what comes out is a pattern of concentration. 182 million children out of the 258 are in only 20 countries. Okay. It's also interesting to categorize the type of crisis to, of course, inform the response. And we really didn't want to leave out any children, including those who have, for example, who are in need of humanitarian food assistance. So there is a dedicated category, and we didn't want to leave out those who were displaced in middle-income countries and who may actually miss the severity cut of the previous versions of this study. So we have a more comprehensive definition, a more comprehensive breakdown of severity, but once again, we see a pattern of concentration. Next slide. I already talked about it. The top 10 countries make up about 2/3 of the global total. You can investigate, if you want, more of these breakdowns in the dashboard that we may have a chance to look at the end of this webinar. We may play around with it together. Once again, the pattern of concentration is quite clear. 38 million out-of-school children are in extreme crisis in Sub-Saharan Africa alone, which is really, unfortunately, the heart of this crisis. And only 60% of affected children live in just 9 protracted crisis countries. So if we really want to prioritize, we have some evidence here to act on. Next slide. As I discussed earlier, this is a quick overview of how exclusion rises as vulnerabilities accumulate. We have in the dashboard different filters. You can play around with different drivers of exclusion by group, by sex, by disability, by severity. And so the trends are quite clear. There's, as I said before, the out-of-school rates for refugees in the most severe crisis is almost double the global one that is calculated on the crisis-affected population. So we see these massive inequities that are amplified by often by disability, gender, and socioeconomic status. In terms of disability, we have about a 12 percentage point gap on average, of course, with a lot of variation. We're only able to calculate this amongst the non-displaced yet crisis-affected children. We don't have enough granularity to go into, for example, IDPs with disabilities, but we were able to really take a deeper dive this time around, and we think that these figures could generalize quite robustly also on forcibly displaced population. Next slide, please. So looking at gender here, I'm not going to go through the cycles. You can see that on the right-hand side, the percentage of girls excluded, unfortunately, increases with the cycles. It increases from 49% to 52% in upper secondary, and it touches really high levels of exclusion, especially amongst refugee populations and children with disabilities. Over. Next slide. We also provide our school rates disaggregated by main driver, the drivers being conflict, socioeconomic, and natural disasters. Of course, we know that the drivers are overlapping, but here we're really looking at the main driver just to have a sort of like broad simplification. And we know the reality is much more complex than that. But we, of course, for any sort of disaggregation of the school rates in emergencies, you will always see that in conflict, exclusion is stronger, and the inequities also tend to be more stark. In terms of children with disability, for the first time, we apply this double premium sort of methodology that helps us, understand better and feel that sort of evidence gaps that exist with the latest research. And we find that essentially, in terms of prevalence, 1 in 4 non-displaced crisis-affected children lives with a disability, which is much higher than the global sort of average, which is about 16%. And the conservative gap, as I said, in our school rate is at least 12 percentage points throughout the grades. Next slide. This is an analysis that I really enjoyed, and I think is probably one of the most important points. It's the one on barriers. So we really had the chance to hear from the affected population what were the causes for that forced them to withdraw their children from school. And as I said before, affected population do care about education, but unfortunately often cannot afford it. If you study the MSNA data in depth and you cluster the reasons or the barriers, you will see that about 80% of missed attendance is fundamentally explained by 2 main factors. One is financial constraints or financial barriers, and the second is conflict-related closures. Okay, so for example, schools destroyed, IDPs are living in the school and the school is no longer accessible. By financial barriers, I mean fees that are too high or just money that is not being available, not being availed for education in the household because livelihoods have been disrupted by the crisis itself. Okay, so 80% of missed attendance can be explained by these 2 factors alone. Now, there's a lot of here we could discuss for hours. You can see here there's the table here on the left with the size of the bob is the relative prevalence of each response, and it's split by boys and girls. And you can see that I think you can have a visual sort of understanding of the concentration around these two drivers that I just mentioned. This is for IDPs. In the report, you will find more disaggregations for refugees, for non-forcibly displaced. What we can conclude is that we can see 3 real barrier archetypes. There's the affordability sort of dominated archetype, which is more prevalent in places like DRC, Haiti, Somalia, Nigeria. We can see conflict supply disruptions, mainly where conflict is toughest, so Myanmar, Sudan. And then we have the exception, if you will, of Afghanistan, where barriers are actually policy-driven. The infamous ban on girls accessing secondary education. Next slide. So this is just from the Mix Plus. It's the case of Nigeria, which happens to be the one with the largest out-of-school population amongst our crisis-affected children. And we see what we see in the literature, the usual suspects, costs as a key reason, massive urban-rural divides, and a clear explanatory power of the level of education of the household head as a predictor of our school rates. Next slide. This is another interesting deep dive, quite a novel finding. Here we looked into two MSNAs, and we looked into transition from primary to secondary in Burkina Faso, and from lower secondary to upper secondary in the Central African Republic. And this is basically a comparison you see on the left-hand side between the transition of crisis-affected yet not forcibly displaced children versus IDPs. Okay, and what you see is that the rate at which IDPs transition into the next education cycle is much, much, much lower. Okay, I was also quite impressed, and is the highest sort of inequity axis, if you will, when you look at all the other inequities axis. So quite a finding here that really must speak to programming and policy. Look, transition for the forcibly displaced happens to a much lower extent. We also see a lot of overage enrollment, but that we kind of knew already. And another key finding by comparing all the MSNA microdata is that IDP overage runs from 5 to 15 percentage point higher. Okay, so not only there's fewer kids in school, but they also progress at a much, much slower pace, which of course increases again on the likelihood of dropout later on. Next slide. We're looking at learning data. Here we're so essentially we have different learning data, some from the mix, some from the ICANN, iCare, from the PAL network, which, by the way, thanks very much to Mohammed Usman for giving us access to the data with a little bit of anticipation before the release. And we essentially look at different ways of measuring foundational learning, essentially, and they all say the same thing. These are mixed data from the foundational learning module. This module is basically measuring foundational skills, which essentially means, a level of proficiency that is pre the minimum proficiency levels in the SDG 4 indicator. You can see that the red learning trajectory is much lower than the other ones. The red learning trajectory is the one is basically data from conflict-affected countries, and you can see how not even by grade 6, okay, 30% of children in conflict-affected countries fail to get to a level that is even pre-411A minimum proficiency level. So there's a huge learning loss associated with being in a country affected by conflict. Not only the starting point is lower, but also the trajectory is lower over the grades. Now, next slide. If we look at a slightly different learning metric, which is again from the ICANN iCar, we see here you have reading, mathematics. The reading is on the left side, mathematics is on the right hand side. And here, imagine, this chart basically takes us into a grade 4 class, and on you see conflict versus natural disasters. These are data at the subnational level. Okay, so that's the share of children who achieve the minimum proficiency level at grade 4 in crisis-affected areas in Kenya and Mozambique. And you can see that those areas that are affected by conflict have abysmal scores. Okay, they're much lower than and much flatter in terms of learning trajectory compared to those of children in areas affected by natural disasters. Okay, next slide. So just to recap, whichever data you look at, conflict is whichever data set you look at, 411B, 411A, mixed FLM, whichever angle you can look at, you can take, essentially, conflict is inexorably and always associated with much lower learning levels, much lower learning trajectories, and much harder to regain learning loss, so to speak. Next slide. yeah, so essentially, I encourage you to have a quick look at both the out-of-school rate in emergencies matrix, which is the matrix with a lot of numbers. Every number is a subgroup in a country. It's disaggregated by sex, by education cycle, by displacement status. These, of course, numbers come with different levels of reliability. Because, of course, some are from MSNAs, so they are super reliable, super fresh. Some others, unfortunately, come from older surveys or had to be either imputed or calculated via a number of linear. Okay, more if you want to dig more into the methodology, I encourage you to read the report. I don't know if you want to have a quick look at the dashboard. Yeah, let's have a quick look at the dashboard. You can filter in the top part by region, by severity. You have different by driver. So, for example, if you look at conflict, you see the dominant primary driver is conflict, unfortunately. And we've seen how conflict, is tough on learning specifically. If you go down in the second part of the dashboard, there's all sorts of disaggregation by level and by sex. So you can look at gender gaps, by region, by primary driver, by severity, and of course by country. Now, an interesting feature of this dashboard, of course, there's a section on disability. There's a section also, there's different sections. I mean, it's quite self-explanatory, but one thing that I wanted to say, the last thing I will say, is that you can click on any country. And if you click on any country, you will basically be transferred to a new window with a little bit of a country profile type thing. That basically should explain to you how the crisis-affected population was calculated, what are the stocks of our school children, what is the key driver, what's the female share of our school children and whatnot. So it's quite a comprehensive piece of, hopefully, of data visualization that hopefully will help us have a common platform and help us with planning, with advocacy, and maybe also with research. And if you clicking around, see that I've done something wrong, please let us know. On this note, I hand it over back to Christian. Thank you very much.
Okay, can you share the presentation again? Yep. Yeah, just one more slide actually before handing it over for a question and answer session. So yeah, as you can see, a wealth of findings, but yeah, we encourage you, of course, check out the dashboard, delve into the report itself. There are some implications that we outlined in the report. Now, these are very broad stroke kind of implications, what we find on the transition findings and so forth. And we identify basically 4 different recommendations or 4 priorities. First of all, a call for actually co-designing this with affected communities. I mean, when you look at the barrier study, this is the clearest direct kind of response, actually what the barriers are on education. And sometimes we forget sort of from our lens of crisis that actually it's oftentimes a mixed set of barriers that families are coping with, many of them financial, but also overlaying them with conflict and so forth. So actually a general call for co-designing the programming with the affected communities themselves. And of course, instruments like the MSNAs are great tools for that. So the first more specific call is really prioritizing timely foundational learning. It's not about EIE just getting children as quickly as possible into school, but also really providing the foundational learning early on for those children. Because we found that if you don't actually early on address these learning gaps, then it's much harder actually to recover these learning gaps later on. And those learning gaps then leads to access issues later on, given the cost. So that's, I think, the first finding that we would want to highlight. Then sort of directly in response to the barrier analysis, reduce financial and structural barriers. So really looking at sort of the calling on the cost factor. For example, in ECW, we do have some cash transfer kind of programs. We will, for example, in response to these findings, look at more in our annual results report with a deep dive on some of these barriers, how we address those with our the programs that we fund, and what our partners are doing in relation to removing these barriers. So directly from the findings, we want to relate it to actually what are we doing on these things, and then what can we improve in the future on that. The structural barriers, this includes, for example, also like hosting refugees. Sort of there are structural barriers that really impede actually integration of refugees into education systems. So that's referring to that sort of the legal barriers that may be there. Then the third point is really investing in catch-up at scale. So really identifying how can you actually make up these learning losses or disruptions that may be there, and looking at sort of structured pedagogy, remedial instruction early on, and how they can also be integrated into national systems over time, so that that actually can really work at scale, not just on a project level. Then the fourth one is really supporting the transition to secondary, as Matteo showed, having sort of the age, the data availability on age, and looking at these transitions. Oftentimes the transition primary to secondary, that's where actually big access transition issues happen. So how can we actually build sort of flexible pathways for students when it comes to the primary, secondary level, but also sort of when you provide non-formal education, what's sort of the pathway to integration into the formal systems, like, and of course through INEE with the accelerated learning, kind of all these initiatives, the learning frameworks, that should really be, I think, the sweet spot of what we should do. Then overall, these sort of are kind of the programming implications. Now, I'm glad that my colleague Nasser from ECW, Education Cannot Wait, has joined, because all of these things will not work without the funding in the background. Of course, we have a very difficult funding situation globally, but we hope that this study sort of offers, beyond sort of the scale that we describe, also a nuance of, well, we know where the needs are actually greatest, where they're situated, where they're concentrated. You have seen the most severe crisis settings are in 20 countries, yeah? It's not like 87 anymore. So we reduced that, and you have 74 million children that are out of school in those settings. So this is perhaps where we should center and target our investments very much. And of course, that's also sort of ECW's campaign, that's where maybe Nasser can say a few words, is we had to reduce our portfolio that was much larger. So we went to a process where we reduced it basically to up to 20 countries, actually. So we are very much sort of in that magnitude at the moment. Now, of course, our funding alone will not kind of address the needs of these 74 million children. So it can be not a single organization. It has to be really a community, an EIE community. But we hope with this study we can basically kick off a whole movement in terms of advocacy, in terms of funding, clarity in data and evidence to actually respond, and then hopefully also being able to actually leverage that additional movement to address the needs of the children listed here. Maybe even Nasser, if you want to say a few words on the campaign, how that is linked to what we are trying to do in ECW.
Yeah, thank you very much, Christian, and welcome everyone to this update. I think this report also comes at a very critical time ahead of the replenishment of both GPE and ECW. GPE happening in September, ECW coming in November. I think this sends a very loud message that these numbers are growing, and that the risk for lost generation is quite costly in a very also concentrated number of countries. That should be very alarming to people. What happens to these children who will become also youth very soon, and on their shoulders lies also the responsibility to rebuild better, to create stability in in entire regions, and be also the business partners, the economic partners, the political partners of the future. So it's quite a timely report. The ECW plans to launch its campaign for its replenishment around mid-August, around the 19th of August. The campaign will go from August up until the 5th of November for the replenishment event. Hopefully also feeding and supporting the overall messages that GPE is putting out there and other partners, that this is now a fight to ensure that education is well funded, not about just ECW is well funded or GP is well funded. I think we need to make sure that education does not fall from the scale of priorities, especially considering the very stark consequences of this funding not meeting its targets. So please, I guess my message is, let's use this report. Let's make sure that these numbers show a very solid argument by all education actors of why we need to attend to this priority and immediately and now, and succeed in this year's replenishment with God's willing. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yes. Maybe we introduce now for just 10 minutes, I would say, the question and answer session. Then we have also some closing remarks from Pfizer, from INEE at the end. I mean, we have more time, so if there is still more questions, yeah, I don't know about Matteo, but I can hang around and we can answer some more questions that you have, or reach out to us via email, of course, to myself in that case. Okay.
There were a few questions already in the chat. Matteo, I'm sure you've seen them already. Would you want to give it a go at these first questions? Or should I?
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah,
a couple of comments quickly. So on disability, I was typing them in the chat myself. So on disability data, yes. I mean, it is a universe that probably deserves a deep dive of its own. And I think ECW is actually going to do that deep dive soon. Because there's all sorts of complications, like type of disability, the severity. So everything that you see here is conservative. There's no doubt. We have, though, I mean, we've looked at evidence anchors of like there's different studies that compare before and after an emergency. There's obviously all the mixed data that we would leverage to calculate prevalence. So yes, it is. Everything is a lower bound, essentially. Everything you see should be considered as a lower bound of an interval. On mother tongue versus instructional host country language, so I could have done it for the PAL network data. I haven't looked into it. There's a lot of, as you can imagine, with such a huge data set, you could write a PhD thesis and a half. I haven't done it. I don't expect it to interact necessarily with the crisis driver, though. So maybe you would have a different intercept in your learning trajectory, so to speak. But I don't think the slope would be necessarily affected. But it's a great point. It's a great point, and I agree. Probably you should have deserved more depth. On the learning trajectory in reference to non-conflict crisis affected, the problem is that we have a very small sample. By using the PAL network data at the L1 level, so the subnational level, I'm really stretching it to its usability, so to speak, because these data were sampled and thought of to calculate national averages, right? They were not really thought for use at subnational level. So you have a lot of floor effects. You have a lot of complications that would make a comparison between crisis affected and non-crisis affected very hard. So, for example, I would have I don't know Cabo Delgado in Mozambique, and I'd have to compare it with Maputo, but it's not quite the same thing. Like so, that comparison is really tough to do. However, we can compare it with regional averages, for example. And essentially what I have seen, and it is in the report, is that if you look at natural disasters, for example, the effect when you compare to regional averages in sub-Saharan Africa is to take back the whole class of a whole year of schooling, essentially, right? So just to give you a broad sort of reference point, but it would be nicer to have more granularity to go in more depth there. Let me see if there's anything else. Seb was asking about funding cuts. I don't know if you want to take it, Christian.
Yes. Well, of course, there's funding cuts on the data landscape, that have implications. I mean, just if you go, for example, online on LinkedIn, you will see, for example, one of our data sources, the MDAT data source, is the University of Louvain. The USAID cuts have led to the possibility of it being discontinued as a project for sort of the database of natural disasters and tracking those things. Now, yeah, you can sign the letter and support sort of funding for a call basically to find funding for MDAT. The same is true. I mean, when we talk with Impact Initiative, the REACH initiatives, MSNAs, we have the largest possible data set now over the last 3 years. I mean, without that data set, we wouldn't have been able to do all this analysis that we did. So there are also big funding constraints, and of course, their eco funding can capture sort of some of those gaps that are left there. So basically, the entire DHS service again of the picture. So it's like basically the whole data landscape needs to be funded to produce this analysis and to be able to sort of take the information where funding is most needed for programming. Then, of course, the funding gaps have consequences on sort of the support that is given to crisis-affected children in programming situations, not outside of the data perspective, and that some studies have been done even with the hub and INEE to look at sort of what's the consequence of some of those funding cuts on programming and access. I mean, for the case of ECW, for example, it has led to a sort of a focus on a much narrower focus on in terms of numbers of countries and crises where we invest. That made us sort of more focused in a way, but it also means that some crises that we previously dealt with, they might not be picked up sort of by GPE and other. I mean, they just fall through the cracks. So that risk exists basically there. So yes, I think that analysis of funding cuts, even if you look at sort of the Orchard GHO, the prioritized funding, and that's something we capture even in our forthcoming end results report, is if you look at the prioritized responses, their education within the humanitarian response plans is there's a much lower percentage compared to the more regular kind of calls for or appeals that are there. So in the prioritization exercise, education is squeezed out in terms of the appeal requirements that are being set by OCHA. So there's a political effort needed to really highlight this. And of course, like this kind of study, we really need to mobilize an EIE community to all not just take it as interesting findings, but it's really to leverage those and use them in your own advocacy. And more targeted advocacy than just the big number, more sort of these nuances like what is the learning trajectory in the conflict settings, much more practical rather than these big numbers that are usually have been used. So that is just some reflections on the past year. Are there more questions?
So one question was about how you work with other entities, for example, like UNICEF, who did the Children Climate Risk Report. There was another question on language higher up. Skills ability. Yeah, Matteo.
I'm going to take a few. So I'm going to go from the last one. So displaced children in crisis did not seem to make up the largest group. That's correct. Because, yes, essentially the majority group is what we called not forcibly displaced. In certain countries, we consider the whole country affected because the whole education system is basically destroyed. Think about Sudan, for example. So there's going to be, of course, there's many ADPs in Sudan, but the majority of the population is not forcibly displaced. It's just think about it as affected locally, affected without forced displacement. Now, this doesn't mean that there is no displacement, livelihoods get eroded, people have to move. But yeah, it's a complicated spectrum of situations. And but it is correct. It is the way we split, so to speak, the global population is in these 4 categories: not forcibly displaced, IDPs, refugees, and asylum seekers. And the non forcibly displaced is by far the biggest chunk. How these 10 countries were identified? No, it doesn't imply that only this country will release it to receive funding. They are just the 10 highest countries in terms of stock of out-of-school children based on the out-of-school rates matrix that we developed through the premia and through the data sets that we discussed at the beginning. So how the data
maybe
is used...
you can respond to Charles' comments from STC. I think he asked about whether it's more the host communities that are allowed to school, IDPs, refugees. I think here the largest group of out of school children.
Yeah, I just took that, right?
Okay.
It was, yeah. So that one, good.
Sorry.
I saw one, so the data is used from ECW to prioritize country funding. There's many things that go into the country allocator, but a lot of it comes from the study. So we want to be, of course, needs based. Maybe, I don't know if Christian wants to talk about it, but maybe it's a bit of an internal thing, less exciting for most of you.
If I may suggest, as we're coming close to the hour, maybe Christian, do you want to make another comment? And then we also have some closing remarks, right?
Yes. Okay. Well, thanks. Just judging from the questions, we are in a way it's exciting because it really triggers a lot of interest and it shows that. So again, if you want to reach out, you can reach out with questions that you may have on the study. But just to thank Matteo for the great work and the presentation for this study. And but before closing, maybe just to hand over to Faiza from INEE to give some closing remarks just from the EIE community's perspective.
Thank you, Christian. I think I want to start first by saying, honestly, really well done to you, Christian, and to the entire ECW team for producing this Global Estimates updates. For the education community, this is a really important moment because it gives us a shared evidence base at a moment where precisely crises are expanding and financing is shrinking. And as we can see from this Global Estimates updates, of course, the headlines are alarming. But what I take from today's conversation and from listening to you and the team is three things. First, families do not give up on education. They continue to prioritize learning no matter what, and that the real barrier to education is economic, structural, and political. The second thing that I take away from today is that educational needs are highly concentrated. You know, we've heard that nearly 80% of out-of-school crisis-affected children are in 20 countries. I think the third thing that I take away from today is that educational exclusion is deeply unequal because crisis does not affect all children in the same way. We've heard refugee children, internally displaced children, children with disabilities face much higher barriers. And so I think for the education community, this report doesn't only give us the numbers, it also gives us direction. Like it gives us a clear basis for collective action. As a sector, we can use this product for advocacy, for prioritization, for programming, for accountability. You know, we know where the needs are the greatest. We know who's being left behind. You know, we know that families continue to prioritize education, and we know what the barriers are. And so I think for the wider education community, this report should push us to be more focused and much more ambitious. We've heard from you and the team today that we need to prioritize foundational learning from the start of an emergency and not to wait until stability returns. We've heard that we need to reduce financial and structural barriers. We've heard that we need at a large scale to have catch-up and remedial learning. And we've also heard that we need to pay much more closer attention to the primary to secondary transition, especially for displaced learners. And so, like you said, you know, no single organization can close this gap, but together as a community, you know, governments, donors, local community, civil society, and partners, my hope is that we can turn this evidence into action. So I'll say this report is really a call to action, and we have a collective responsibility to use this evidence that's available to us to make more informed decisions and to take collective action. I'll stop there and back to you.
Thanks a lot, Faiza. Well, we are basically 1 minute after the hour. Thanks a lot for the great interest, and thanks for the hub, for Petra, for organizing this. I mean, just I think there were 250 people registered at least. I don't know, it's not as many that on the call, but it really shows the interest is there, and it really is heartening for, I would say, if I may speak on behalf of you, Matteo, for you and me, and all, for us working over the last 6 months on this study, really, that we hope this can turn the tide a bit in terms of the whole narrative, in terms of in direction and clarity, and maybe then that hope aspect that we want to start to instill after this whole humanitarian reset that we have, and to really help us actually mobilize the funding that is needed to really ease the plight of crisis-affected children and the stories we have captured in this report. So thanks everybody who joined the call. If you want, please reach out. You have the email address, my email address mentioned on the presentation slides, and engage with the data, use it, do your research with it, advocate with it, and hopefully it will really turn the tide. Thanks a lot, and I wish you a great rest of the day.